Welcome to Philosophy with Shing, where we uncover the beauty behind philosophy. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the question, is there more to ethics than personal preferences? So, when breaking down this question, there are some assumptions that are made in the question. That, firstly, ethics is only a matter of personal preference. And this idea of personal preference is also linked to ethics being perhaps subjective rather than objective. And the fact that the question is even asking whether there is more to ethics than personal preferences suggests that there is some sort of universal ethical or moral standards in the first place. So this implies that there are moral standards in the first place. So in order to answer this question, we need to address whether is this true, whether there are actually moral standards in the first place, and also to address whether or not ethics is an idea or linked to personal preferences. And in defining the idea of more in this question, I would think that more means more layers besides subjectivity. So maybe we could explore the idea of objectivity in ethics, and also the idea of personal is another key term to define, which implies that personal implies that ethics is very individual dependent and could vary across individuals. Means there is no like universal moral standard. So here is a way to unpack this question. Um, in my view, I think that there's more to ethics than personal preferences. In fact, I would argue that ethics is not about personal preferences. So my stance would be there is more to ethics than personal preferences. And that in fact, I would argue that ethics is not about personal preferences. And of course, we need to bring in some philosophical theories to back us up in our stance, and we will do so in due course. So in defending this stand, before we even go and talk about what are these um, what are these alternatives to ethics rather than personal preferences, we need to first establish that there are moral standards in the first place. Because if there are no moral standards, then this question would not be valid in that sense. Because if there are no moral standards, then we don't even need to ask what ethics is made out of, which is essentially what this question is asking. They're asking, is there more to ethics than personal preferences? Which implies that there is something to ethics. So we need to first establish that indeed, why is it that we agree that there is something more that we can define ethics per se? So we have our argument zero, which is to agree with the implied assumption in the question that there are moral standards in the first place. So we say yes, there are moral standards. Why are there moral standards? I'll bring in the idea of nihilism, which suggests that if there are no moral standards, what are the consequences? After agreeing with the implied assumption in the question that there are moral standards, that's why we're even asking this essay question in the first place, I will say that some people may say that I'll bring up a counter argument, which is ethics may be solely personal preferences to some people, and why is it that ethics may be solely a personal preference for some people might be due to the apparent subjectivity of ethics. So this would be my target argument, and then I would like counter it. So the apparent subjectivity of ethics can be seen in Emotivism by A.J. Ayer, which suggests that whatever ethical statements are merely statements of emotion. So they are very subjective, because if we are saying like killing is wrong, we are essentially saying killing boo, where this idea of wrongness or rightness is only an expression of emotion. And because of that, we all know that emotion is more subjective, so ethics might be solely personal preferences if ethics is merely expressions of emotion. And then we go on to our second argument, which is, however, beyond personal preferences, ethics is also dependent on the wider social context. So I'm addressing here about the wider social context to show that ethics is not only about individuals, but also perhaps objective ethical standards that apply across society. And so that lends a bit of objectivity to ethics. And I would use relativism to support this, where relativism is essentially where whatever is ethical is whatever that is relative to each society and agreed upon by each society. So that could explain why ethical standards are different across societies, because whatever is ethical is whatever is defined by the society itself. And then I move on to the third argument, which is, yet ethics is not solely due to personal preferences, and it's also not entirely subjective, because there are flaws to theories attempting to represent ethics as subjective. So I say yes, there might be some arguments that suggest that ethics is somewhat subjective, or there's not really an entirely universal standard of ethics because of emotivism, relativism, but despite that, ethics is not solely due to personal preferences, because there are flaws to arguments 1 and 2, essentially. And then I'll address the flaws of emotivism and relativism, where the flaws are not exactly, where the flaws are essentially what the theories do not account for in reality. So, for example, if I say killing is wrong means killing boo, a flaw of this theory would be that then there is no such thing as an ethical standard. And if that's the case, why is it that everybody agrees that killing is wrong? So I would be refuting emotivism and relativism. And then in my last argument, I would summarize my line of thought and also introduce some new theories which should deal with the scientific aspect of ethics. So I would say, hence, ethics also has an objective element to it. And it's more than just subjective preferences. How I would buttress this argument is to say that this idea of ethics having an objective element to it is also reflected in reality. So because I have established in argument 3 that ethics is not solely due to personal preferences, therefore, I would say that ethics also has an objective element. So we are arguing about subjective versus objective. And I will throw out some theories that could support the idea that ethics has an objective element to it by talking about naturalism, which is ethical naturalism. Ethical naturalism is essentially saying that whatever is moral is whatever is found in nature. So, for example, it's moral to like eat your husband just because tarantulas do that, or just because some spider does that. And then I would talk about evolutionary ethics, which could be similar to naturalism, but evolutionary ethics essentially says something like whatever is moral is whatever we have done to make ourselves evolve to today. So if societal cooperation has allowed us to thrive and survive over the years and evolve over centuries, thousands of years. Therefore, societal cooperation is ethical instead of killing each other or pitting each other or pitting ourselves against each other, for example. But at the same time, when I'm addressing these theories, right, of naturalism, evolutionary ethics, I will also highlight the flaws of each of these theories. So in a way, I'm eliminating the theories that could explain whether ethics is more than personal preference. So you see, right, if ethics also has an objective element to it, and I'm addressing and introducing various theories that could explain whether ethics has an objective element to it, I will also have to systematically refute theories that sound flawed, but still try to address why ethics has an objective element to it before finally reaching the theory that I think best explains ethics, which is intuitionism. So, intuitionism provides an objective element to ethics, but I would argue in answering this question that the flaws of intuitionism are not as big as those in naturalism, evolutionary ethics, emotivism, relativism, yeah, in arguments 1 and 2. So that would be how I would approach the question. And my concluding statement, represented by C, is hence intuitionism may be the moral standard of ethics, and ethics is not really about personal preferences. Thereby going back to the question and answering the question. So that would be how I would, this is essentially my roadmap to answering the question. You can see it here. And I would be explaining in greater detail how I would approach such a question now. Across the various areas of knowledge in epistemology, it is thought that ethics is the most subjective and internalist field, leaving some to reduce ethics to merely an expression of one's personal preferences. However, I disagree and put forth the notion that ethics is more than personal preferences. In fact, I would argue that ethics is perhaps not a matter of personal preferences. This is because there are flaws in treating ethics as solely subjective, and there is objectivity in ethics that are also reflected in reality. In answering this question, I will define more, the term more in the question, as more layers to ethics than just the subjectivity of ethics, and personal preferences to mean dependent on the individual, and varying across individuals. The question also has the underlying assumptions that there are moral standards in the first place and that ethics is highly subjective. I will address these assumptions in my response to the question too. Firstly, the fact that there are moral standards needs to be addressed before any further discussion on the nature of ethics can take place. Hence, I argue that there are moral standards in our world. Should moral nihilism exist, the world would have descended into chaos due to the lack of societal order. For instance, if there were no moral standards, people would not have to behave in a civil way around others, and occurrences of theft, murder, and the like would have prevailed. However, in reality, this is not how our society looks like, due to the world having some form of ethical standards by which they follow. This is further supported by Thomas Hobbes' contractarianism, which posits that individuals abide by a common set of rules that they classify as morals because it would benefit them more to follow an ethical standard as a society, also known as a social contract, assuming that the individuals are mainly driven by self-interest. So I first established, as you could see, what are the consequences of Nietzsche's nihilism, and then I brought in Thomas Hobbes' contractarianism to further substantiate my argument that there cannot be no ethical standards in society because of the dire consequences and how we do not really see the lack of moral standards in our society in reality. Okay, so going back to contractarianism. So, um, once again, just now, as I mentioned, their individuals abide by a common set of rules that they classify as morals because it will benefit them more to follow an ethical standard. This is due also to a lowered sense of threat when there are a set of moral standards everyone follows, so that individuals would not be in danger of being killed or assaulted on a daily basis. I will argue that social contractarianism, as suggested by Thomas Hobbes, thus exists in our world today. Hence, there are moral standards. To some people, ethics may be solely personal preferences due to the apparent subjectivity of ethics. So I have already addressed A0. I'll be moving on to A1. This is a view espoused by A.J. Ayer's emotivism, which postulates that moral statements made by individuals are only statements conveying that individual's emotions towards an action. For example, if I were to claim that killing is immoral, I would just be saying killing bull, as I mentioned just now. Going by this line of reasoning, there is no basis of morality, as every statement explaining morality will only be a display of emotions. Underlying this concept is the claim that ethics is subjective and hence arbitrary. To perceive ethics as only that of personal preference is hence problematic, and I will discuss this later on. So after addressing what emotivism is, I would tell my reader that I would be talking about the flaws of emotivism in argument 3. But before I talk about the flaws of emotivism, I would have to address relativism in argument 2. So that's A1 done. So now we're going on to A2. Beyond personal preferences, ethics is also dependent on the wider social context an individual is residing in. Hence, ethics is not only about an individual's preferences, but could also be dependent on the preferences of a group or a collective. Ethical relativism supports this view and posits that ethical claims are relative to each society due to the plethora of cultures existing in our world today. And the diversity of cultures lead to the emergence of various and differing ethical standards. For example, polygamy is considered ethical and may even be encouraged in some countries, but are viewed as a form of infidelity in others. Similarly to emotivism, cultural relativism is flawed. Hence, ethics is indeed more than personal and societal preferences. So you see here that I am branching out from personal preferences to also include that of societal preferences. So this idea of personal, right, could be personal and individual to a person or to society. So that idea of individual to a person was addressed in argument 1, and individual to a particular society was addressed in argument 2. Now we'll be moving on to argument 3, where I will be addressing how ethics is not solely due to personal preferences because there are flaws to the theories attempting to represent ethics as subjective. In this case, it will be emotivism and relativism and their flaws. Ethics is not solely due to personal preferences because there are flaws to the theories attempting to represent ethics as subjective, and dependent on personal preferences. Responding to A.J. Ayer's emotivism, to perceive ethics as a personal preference would inevitably lead to the condoning of obviously immoral acts. One example is female genital mutilation, which is prevalent in parts of South Africa, and honor killing in parts of Pakistan and India. By the same token, relativism encourages apathy of others towards another's culture, leading to the continuation of immoral acts. Admittedly, cultural relativism does have its merits in being able to account for moral disagreements in our world. However, the role in ethics that relativism attributes culture to play is simply too exaggerated, and it is not only culture that drives and sets ethical standards. Hence, there is more to ethics than personal preferences. As such, so I have already talked about the flaws of emotivism and relativism. As such, I argue that ethics also has an objective element to it. So that will be going on to argument 4, and is more than just subjective preferences. This is also reflected in our world today. However, there are many proponents for the view that morality is objective. Hence, I will seek to evaluate each view. So there are many proponents for the view that morality is objective, including stuff like naturalism, evolutionary ethics, intuitionism, and I will seek to evaluate each of these views. So the first one will be moral naturalism, which postulates that there are objective moral facts that are external to the individual, and these moral facts can be found by observing the behavior of the natural world or the behaviors of human beings. While moral naturalism confirms that there is objectivity in ethics rather than subjectivity, I argue that moral naturalism is fallacious because it falls prey to the More's naturalistic fallacy. So one of the major flaws to naturalism is More's naturalistic fallacy. More's naturalistic fallacy states that one cannot reduce moral properties to natural properties, which is what is implied in moral naturalism. This is further supported by G.E. Moore's open question argument. So you got your open question argument, which aims to show that moral questions are open questions. Thus, questions such as is pleasure good is an open question that is meaningful, and not a meaningless question, the latter which is what moral naturalism implies by equating moral properties with natural properties. David Hume's is-ought fallacy also comes into play to support how moral naturalism is fallacious. So our is-ought fallacy. And this is Hume's is-ought fallacy. Hume's is-ought fallacy postulates that just because a phenomenon is, does not mean that it ought to be. In other words, it is a flawed assumption to claim that just because nature behaves a certain way means that it is moral if one emulates the behavior of nature. Anecdotally, a counterexample to moral naturalism that illustrates the is-ought fallacy would be how female black widows devour their mate after mating, rendering their act a form of cannibalism, but it is immoral to practice cannibalism in our world. Hence, while moral naturalism shows that ethics is more than just personal preferences, it is flawed and hence cannot be accepted as a basis of morality. Then, over here, I've already spoken about naturalism and its flaws, and I'll be moving on to another ethical view that espouses that there is moral objectivity rather than personal preferences, and that would be evolutionary ethics. However, I argue that evolutionary ethics is also ridden with flaws and cannot be accepted as a basis of morality. Evolutionary ethics posits that what is moral is a product of natural selection, where what is moral is what species have been doing that led them to survive until today. Quoting social Darwinism on the concept of the survival of the fittest, evolutionary ethics claims that those who had practiced acts that allowed the continuity of their species should have their acts deemed as moral. While evolutionary ethics does provide grounds to explaining why there is a common consensus on ethics, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I will write that here. As all humans descend from the same origins, evolutionary ethics is dangerously flawed. For one, the subscription of one to evolutionary ethics leads to the condoning of eugenics, which is immoral and contentious. If one subscribes to evolutionary ethics, Acts such as the sterilization of Carrie Buck without her consent due to her disabilities would be morally permissible, as with the systematic extermination of Jews by the Nazis who sought to eliminate an inferior race and protect the Aryan race. Furthermore, evolutionary ethics falls prey to More's naturalistic fallacy. So I'll draw the arrow up to More's naturalistic fallacy and Hume's is-ought fallacy, as evolutionary ethics, akin to moral naturalism, equates moral properties to natural properties, which is inherently problematic. Hence, while there is an objective basis of morality, and morality is more than personal preferences, evolutionary ethics is not the basis of morality. And after I have refuted naturalism and evolutionary ethics, I will go on to argue that intuitionism may be the moral standard of ethics. More's intuitionism suggests that morality is innate in human beings and that we are born with it. As such, there is an objective basis of morality as everyone is born with the same form of intuitionism. The merits of intuitionism outweigh its flaws, and hence I argue that it may be the moral standard. For one, intuitionism does not fall prey to the naturalistic fallacy. Being derived directly from nature, intuitionism does not reduce moral properties to natural properties, but is instead nature itself as one is born with it. So you're born with it. And does not fall prey to the naturalistic fallacy, NF for short. Moral intuitionism also explains phenomena such as lawmaking, where a country's laws are generally agreed upon by its people. Across countries, there are also many similarities across laws and legislation, pointing to the possibility of intuitionism driving us as a world in making our moral standards. Of course, some critics may put forth the notion that there is no basis for proof of intuitionism, as there is no empirical evidence to suggest intuitionism exists. I acknowledge that there is no empirical proof of intuitionism, but I argue that intuitionism is a highly certain proposition that has a high probability of existing due to phenomena such as cultures sharing more ethical similarities than differences that suggest intuitionism to be the uniting basis of morality across humanity. Other critics may suggest that moral intuitionism does not account for moral disagreements and dilemmas that still persist in our world today. On the contrary, I argue that ultimately, intuitionism is the objective basis upon which morality stands upon, and the existence of these dilemmas are not the reason for rejecting intuitionism. Rather, the reason for moral disagreement is due to the difference in interpretation of the facts of a situation that lead to the application of intuitionism in differing manners. For example, on the issue of euthanasia, one person can be against euthanasia because they view it as suicide and killing is immoral, but another may perceive euthanasia as a deed that alienates suffering, alienates or ameliorates suffering. Evidently, both groups of people can have moral intuition, yet disagree on an issue, not because intuitionism does not exist, but because of their differing interpretations of a situation. Hence, I argue that moral intuitionism is the objective basis of morality, and there is more to ethics than personal preferences. Ultimately, as the question has an implicit assumption that one part of ethics is that of personal preferences, I argue that ethics is not about personal preferences at all. This is because of the flaws of non-cognitivist meta-ethical theories in describing morality as that of personal preferences, and that the view that ethics is based on personal preferences simply does not correspond with the external reality of the world. Hence, I posit that ethics is objective and external to the individual, and that ethics is based on moral intuitionism, as this is reflected in the real world, and its merits outweigh its flaws. Thus, there is an ethical basis that guides our actions. In conclusion, I argue that there is more to ethics than personal preferences, and there is an objective basis of ethics, and that ethics is not about personal preferences. So that would be my view on this question: is there more to ethics than personal preferences? And I've also shown us how to use certain ethical, meta-ethical theories to support our views. So I hope you enjoyed it and see you at our next episode. Goodbye.